Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you for being here. We have a tough topic today, and I mean it. Here we go. What's something you wish you never saw? Not safe for work, it deserves it. Please remember to like, share, say hi, and subscribe.
Trigger warning. Viewer discretion is advised. Watching my dad die. That feeling of helplessness has always stuck with me. He was convulsing terribly and all I could do was watch. For the longest time I blamed myself, thinking there's more I could have done. Maybe prayed. That night he also said the sweetest thing to me, that he will never let me suffer. He had never said something like that to me all my life. It's been 8 years since then. I still miss him. When I was 19, I lived in Santiago, Chile for a time. Chile is a wonderful and very modern, but one thing that shocks many Westerners are the street dogs. Even nice, affluent neighborhoods will have mangy, filthy, half-starved dogs wandering the streets and laying on the sidewalks. Not sure why, but Chileans don't really pay them any mind, and Chilean animal control only removes strays if they are aggressive. So the dogs are chill and don't bother anyone. It's just sad to see them dirty and suffering. One day I was walking down a residential street with a companion and a cute little red-brown puppy came bounding across the road to greet us. This puppy was too clean and healthy to be a stray. It was definitely someone's pet that had escaped and it was running with that excited gait puppies get when they meet new people. The puppy did not see it was running directly into the path of an oncoming van. The puppy saw the speeding van at the last moment and crouched low on the pavement. The front of the van passed over it, but the rear bumper struck it in the head, killing it instantly, and it tumbled end over end before lying dead in the street, blood gushing from its nose and mouth. I was horrified at what I'd just witnessed, but I didn't know that worse emotional trauma was coming. As soon as the van was gone, two large, mangy, dirt-covered street dogs darted out from some dark corner and began fighting over the puppy's corpse. I watched two savage dogs tear apart the body of a puppy which only a moment before had been happily bounding over to meet me with a tail wagging and ears flopping. Both dogs retreated with part the puppy's remains in their jaws, leaving only a puddle of blood, fur, and viscera on the asphalt. I almost vomited right there. In an instant, I fully understood the meaning of the phrase dog-eat-dog world. It was the most terrible thing I've ever witnessed. It messed me up for days, and I will never forget it. I wish I'd never seen it. Some arsehole delivery guy deliberately ran over a kitten. We warned him that it had just wandered under the car. The F-head just stared at us, then run straight over it. He then got out while laughing and picked it up by the ear and threw it in our direction. I will never forget seeing that poor little kitten's body shaking with blood over its face. Then I had to knock on the lady's door and let her know that the piece of shit that just delivered her pizza deliberately ran over her kitty. Putting animals to sleep every day, or almost every day. I run a veterinary practice. When the whole family comes in and the 3-year-old watches mom and dad crying and asks you why Daisy is going to heaven, the lump is always there in the back of my throat giving the answer. Never gets easier. The inside of my son's chest after his surgery. Due to his age, 2 weeks, his chest had to be kept open with some clear plastic over it. They put a little loose bandage over the top, but it slid down and it was just really difficult to see. I didn't even get that clear look, just enough to see a cavity. My mother's crash site. My mom owned and operated a small tour ride business with a horse and carriage. When I was 18, she was killed in a rear-end collision involving a distracted driver. I lived only a quarter mile from the crash site and heard the ambulance going by my studio apartment on the way to the scene of her crash. I didn't know at the time they were on their way to scrape her body from the road. All I knew was the dogs next door were howling to match the sound of the sirens. I kind of found it funny. I got the call about 20 minutes later, then collapsed in a fit of rage and agony. The next thing I remember was being in the back seat of my in-law's car. She said it would be a good idea to get away from there, being so close to the crash site. I stupidly disagreed. As she pulled to the street, leaving my apartment complex, I jumped out and ran towards the scene. The only thing even remotely recognizable was the carriage itself. Thankfully, my mother was already gone, but the blood wasn't. The guts weren't. The chaos wasn't. The grim energy of death and tragedy still loomed in the air, and more so on the face of everyone who had to witness my world being shattered in real time. The loose items that belonged to my mom were still scattered across the ditch line. I picked up a few things that were important and grabbed the hoodie she kept in the storage compartment. I held it to my neck, crying into it and smelling that familiar perfume-kissed fabric. Bad idea. It was covered in battery acid, and I burned my hands and face. My clothes had holes in them a few hours later, and the hoodie was a lost cause. Anything that touched that hoodie needed to be scrubbed. I fumbled for my phone to call my sister who lived out of state, but she had somehow already found out about it. We couldn't make full words, but we knew that life would never be the same. It's been 5 years and I still think about it. I still remember in the patch of gravel a pool of antifreeze mixing with a steady stream of horse blood. I still remember how the front seat of the carriage was bent about 45 degrees from the impact that broke my mother's back in two. I still hear my family pleading with me to get back in the car, unable to complete their request in my frozen state of shock and horror. I regret all of it. I should have stayed in the car. I should have looked from a distance and let my mind convince me that it couldn't have been that bad. My imagination wouldn't have been nearly as effective at traumatizing me. No, my mind wasn't dark enough to create something so vile. Really had me beat that day. My mother isn't the only one who died that day. I'll never be the same person. I wish I never saw that.
I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry you saw that. I think a lot of us would have probably done the same thing you did, so I'm just sorry.
My old man held up at gunpoint. I was around 5 or 6. Myself and the old man, Dad, were in the car headed home. A black sedan was following us the entire way home. We turned, they turned. We stopped, they stopped. The old man was glued to the rear vision mirror, watching that car like a cat hunting a bird. The old man was silent the entire way home. No radio, no chatter, no heavy breathing, just glued to the mirror. We turned into our home street. A few moments later, the black car turned into the street. I'll never forget the old man still glued to the rear vision mirror as we pulled up outside home saying, "Whatever happens, stay in the car. Now get under the seat." Old man got out of the car in the driveway. 3 to 4 seconds later, I saw the black car pull up, another car pull up, then a load of other cars pull up, and what looked like a concert of people in the front yard. Guns drawn, shotguns, helmets, all black men in the yard. "Police, get the F on the ground!" Then I was met with the barrel of a 9mm at the window. Cops opened the door and got me out of the car. I stood there and watched the old man in handcuffs take on about 8 cops trying to get him in that van. 2 of which with their guns still out and up on him. He was wanted for an armed robbery in Sydney back in the early 2000s. It's a long, cold drive to Goulburn, that's all I can say. First time I saw a firearm. Last time I saw the old man. For a while anyways. A video of a 14-year-old boy falling off a ride at a park, hit the ground and died. It made it worse knowing I have a now 16-year-old younger brother. All I could think of was what if it was my brother in that seat. I can't express the mix of emotions I felt after seeing it. Not as awful as some of these posts, but hoping writing this down does something to erase it from my memory, like when you get an earworm. Was speaking to a lady today, pleasant conversation, when suddenly something dropped out of her mouth and onto her lip. She kept talking with it there. I couldn't look away. I swear it was a rather large tonsil stone or something equally as gross. Then she suddenly realized and just licked it back into her mouth and carried on talking. I've balked several times today just thinking of this. When I was in combat near Karbala Gap in Iraq, I saw a BMP explode about 100 meters in front of my vehicle. The top of the turret, one, rocketed into the sky from the force of the explosion and came crashing down about 20 feet from my vehicle. As I drove us past the now destroyed BMP, knowing full well what a round from an Abrams tank minigun can do to the occupants of a vehicle, I said to myself, "Don't look in there, nothing you want to see." In my driver's perch in my M113A3, my head was a good 9 to 10 feet above the ground. With the destroyed BMP to our left, I had a perfect vantage point and, for some reason, couldn't seem to stop myself from looking down into the bowels of the mangled vehicle. Inside, I saw one of the crew members who apparently just had time enough to shriek in terror as the tank round, enormous pressure change, and explosion twisted his body into a mangled mess of what used to be his torso. It looked as though a massive drill bit had caught in his flesh and spun his torso around in a tight knot, at least until it all ruptured and began to burn. His head didn't move much, nor did his legs, but his torso twisted on an axis of his sternum or thereabouts. I can close my eyes any time and see that poor man all over again. Not that I ever do, because seeing it once was plenty. I work in the funeral industry, and I'll never forget the first time I saw a child. Her family was messed up as it was, and we'd just served them 6 months before when her dad shot himself in the front of his girlfriend and the 3 daughters. My mom was on a downward spiral. She'd gotten really bad into drugs and was shacking up with some less than admirable folk. The little girl was just shy of 2 years old, and she'd had an autopsy. She was so small, and it looked like she'd seen SA and strangled. Cause of death was deemed inconclusive. She was with the uncle and new boyfriend of the mom at the time of death. Still makes me sad.
I mean, all of these are hard, so really, whatever I'm saying is basically irrelevant except for that I'm sorry. So, but kids...
I started 6th grade in August of 2001. I always think about my life as a child being bifurcated by 2 me's. The first me was a massive overachiever, never got less than a 96 on any report card in 6 years of elementary school, constantly engaged, eager to learn, outgoing. Something in junior high changed, and I stopped caring. I got B's and C's throughout junior high and high school. I procrastinated. I hated anything I wasn't immediately good at. I realized today that seeing 3,000 people die on live television a month into my 6th grade year may have had something to do with my perspective shift. Just being 11, watching tiny dots jump out of a skyscraper and plummet helplessly to their death just to avoid the terror or burning alive, perhaps had an indelible consequence on my developing psyche. I wonder what a lot of our lives would be like if we hadn't seen that as children. Every ounce of innocence was forcibly taken. A picture of this teenage girl with a tumor in her mouth that was the size of an effing soccer ball. Her mouth was all stretched open, and there was just loads of tumor mass in her mouth with veins and shit. Her teeth were all pushed outward by the tumor too. Poor girl. But I needed to bleach my brain after seeing that. I've never forgotten it. I have nightmares about seeing that again. My dog dying. I went to sleep at 2 a.m. with him heavily breathing, knowing he might not make it through the night. When I woke up 4 hours later, I found him in the exact spot as when I went to bed. He probably died shortly after I fell asleep. My heart broke, knowing he suffered in his last moments. I sat there for a couple minutes petting him, hoping he might move, but he didn't. Soon after, I had to get rid of the body so nobody else found him, and inevitably I rolled him up in a blanket on his bed and threw the body to the trash. I felt so bad about it. I couldn't stop crying about it for the whole day. I loved that little effer so much. When I was in class 4, we had a student who always got annoyed by bully. One time in our class, the student stood up and gave a big complaint about the bully, but due to the student's bad behavior, the teacher told the student to stand outside. The student was mad, then he suddenly ran to the balcony and tried to jump, but the teachers caught him. Wow, that was hard to read. Back in the 2000s, when I was working at a bike shop, a cyclist got into an accident about 100 meters away from our store. He wasn't one of our customers, but we heard honk, crash, and naturally looked outside. We saw a bike and ran to see if we could help. The man had an 8-inch laceration on his thigh, and pretty sure he was bleeding out through his femoral artery. People were in shock and did not realize they were watching a man bleeding to death. I got down on my knees, grabbed a belt, and fashioned a tourniquet while I yelled at someone to call an ambulance. The nearest hospital was not far, but it still took about 30 to 40 minutes for them to show up. Oof. The bleeding never stopped. It only slowed, and I kept talking to the man and asking him questions. His leg was effed, and it was the nastiest thing I'd ever seen. Eventually they came. He was miraculously stabilized. My hands and arms were covered with this man's lifeblood. I took 3 days off and had to see a therapist for like 2 years. A plane crashed into the house across the street from the bar I work at. I'm good friends with the occupants. Instinct made me abandon ship and make sure they were okay, and we made it out okay. Stepped over 2 flaming torsos before I realized what the F. It was just a 4-seater. Had 3 people inside when it came down. They basically exploded on impact. Burning humans smell very similar to barbecued pigs. My friends made it out physically okay, and I no longer eat meat.
Your reaction was great. Finding your fight or flight response, you did a great thing, and probably responsible for at least partially saving that person's life.
My boss, who I utterly despise, as he regularly eats his boogers, trims his nose hair with our office scissors, and then licks the scissors clean, sneezes into his hand and licks the palm, collects his cuticles in a pile and eats them like sprinkles, no way, and much more. Just today, he scraped his face and scalp with his bank card and collected the grease and dandruff on a sheet of paper that's on the table of a coworker. I gave her a heads up and to throw the paper away when she comes in tomorrow. I almost puked on my desk before. He is also the most incompetent man I've ever met. He also has a habit of suddenly and violently moving around in his chair when everyone is working quietly and concentrating so that we all get startled to no end. It takes all my strength to not yell at him or cry out of frustration. He's my boss and I need the money. I'm going to quit soon because I can't stand his presence. I'm at work right now and on the verge of a nervous breakdown because my boss has just startled me to death again and is now hammering away on his keyboard like a deranged man. I'm already in therapy because of this job. Thanks for reading. Finding my grandmother dead in her bed. The whole finding her dead thing wasn't the issue, as she was nearly 80 years old and had physically declined to the point where she was living in a hospital bed in our living room like Charlie Bucket's grandparents, so she was basically running out the clock at this point. No. The thing that scarred me was she apparently died getting back in bed from the commode and didn't pull her nightgown down. Her entire lower half was completely uncovered, and she had one leg on the bed and the other on the floor, leaving all her downstairs business completely exposed. There's nowhere near enough booze or therapy in the world to erase that image from my brain. I also inadvertently horrified everyone else in the house, since the first thing I did when I found her dead was sprint upstairs to tell everyone, and in my panic I forgot to warn them. We quickly covered her up with a blanket. We probably horrified the people who came to take her body away as well, because they removed the blanket before we had a chance to warn them, and they went, "Whoa, wasn't expecting that." I was on vacation in a taxi, and we drove by a car crash. One of the passengers was outside the car crying with her head in her hands. The driver was slumped over the steering wheel. Emergency services was there, but they weren't doing anything with the driver, just comforting the passenger crying. I couldn't tell if the driver was dead because we passed the scene in a few seconds, but everything that was happening was pointing to that being the case. Seeing what is presumed a dead body still haunts me to this day, and that was 10 years ago. Well, not saw, but heard. So it was around 10 to 11 at night, and I was in my room just preparing to sleep when I heard footsteps on the second floor. I have 2 floors plus an attic, which I sleep in. It's quite a luxury attic. And, mind you, my mother was fast asleep, and my sister is not allowed to leave her room. She's 6, and also was asleep. So when I heard those footsteps, they were kinda loud. I got a full-blown panic attack. I have a diagnosed anxiety disorder. And, special detail, my dad was at work and was not home until 2 a.m. And one of my biggest fears is homicide. Yeah, me too. Someone breaking in and whatnot. So I called a friend of mine, shaking, crying in pure fear. She eventually helped me calm down and I went to sleep, and I have still no idea what the fluff that was.